Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. Today, I am joined by Wayne Renbjor. I totally botched it again, Wayne. You're going to have to say your name for the audience because will you say it for me?
It's Renbjor.
Renbjor. So we're joined today with Wayne Renbjor, who is here to talk to us about emotional intelligence. He's going to give us some of his background. The fun thing about having Wayne on the show is Wayne and I have known each other for quite some time. He actually reached out to me probably 5 years ago when I was on an interview on Entrepreneur on Fire, and he said, "Hey, I really love your story. I'm excited about what you're doing. Tell me how I can support." He was the producer for the Conscious Marketing podcast and we've done some projects together. So it's really fun to get an opportunity to speak to you, Wayne. Thank you so much for joining us. And let's talk emotional intelligence. So first, if you don't mind, why don't you kind of just give the audience an overview of who you are, what you do, and some context around that, and then we'll dive in.
Sure. So, more directly today and relevant to what I'm doing is I am currently the director for software engineering for a small agency in Philadelphia called Taman Technologies. Basically, it's just a normal web and slash marketing agency. Nothing super special with that one, but our unique kind of identifier is we really have a primary focus on accessibility in almost everything we do. So our tagline is that we build the inclusive web, and we really believe in just making sure everything is accessible for everyone. There's no reason to keep information from people, regardless of what it is. Other than that, I mean, clearly you've known me for a while, but I kind of touch everything, like from barbecue, computer programming, working with forging, like actual metal and iron working kind of things, car repair, etc., all of the above. So I'm involved in a lot of stuff all the time.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite little known secrets about you is that you were a barbecue judge, a barbecue competition judge, and ran a very successful barbecue podcast.
Yeah, both at the same time. So podcasting too is in there. So a lot of
Yeah.
things in that belt.
Excellent. So let's get started with just kind of start at the basics. So tell me a little bit about what emotional intelligence means to you.
So really, I think emotional intelligence in general, I think it just kind of falls into the line of empathy and really having an awareness and an understanding of not only what your words and actions are doing, but how people are responding to that. And especially in a marketing and or leadership position where you have people that are reporting to you and that trust you to give them good guidance. And you need to understand how to kind of navigate that situation, whether or not there's interpersonal conflicts or if they're just stressed out, how you can kind of help with that. And then on the marketing side of the house, how to make sure that you're connecting with the right target audience and not just from a sales perspective, just to kind of close a deal, but more making sure that you're in alignment with who your target is. So that way you're providing the best service to them and they also have a great relationship with you and that's trusting and fun, honestly.
Yeah, excellent. I love that. So I love how you kind of open the conversation so we can take it in two different directions. So you talk about it from a leadership capacity and then you talk about it from a marketing capacity. So let's start with a leadership angle in terms of how do you deploy emotional intelligence at the workplace and what kind of shifts have you seen over the last, 5, 10 years in terms of how employees display emotions at the workplace?
So definitely over the past couple of years, it's increased drastically. So, me being born literally in 1980, the oldest millennial that you can find, I came up through, the 80s and 90s growing up. And so you saw when it was still very difficult for women to be in a workplace, for men to show emotion, fathers had to be stoic and not caring. That has shifted from the emotional revolutions that were happening in the 90s and early 2000s to now, even though it's fought still by older people as quote being a snowflake or something along those lines, which is unfortunate. But it's people now being willing to open up and not being scared, like, hey, I am a human and I am emotional and this is what I'm going through. Then it's learning how to deal with that. And even my own personal growth, like I grew up in Texas in the 90s. So there have been attitudes and positions and thoughts in my head that are very counter to where I am as a person today and its growth. And I've had people that have worked for me recently that have opened up where I can see how they're reacting to a situation, whether it be around their personal sexual orientation or just their gender and how they're being treated. Where I know just how things were being raised back in 10, 15, 20 years ago, I would have reacted to that horribly compared to having to grow as my own person and saying, well, no, I have to respond to this appropriately, and I have to understand that I should also be this kind of vulnerable and work with them and figure out how to help the situation regardless of any past beliefs or anything that I've had, and try to grow as my own personal um you know my own person, period. With that.
Yeah, I think that that's probably an area I've seen tons of growth in for myself as well as other leaders is one, just becoming more aware of your own emotions and how you are in the office. Like, I know I've always, well, I'm not going to say I've always, I actually was a very unemotional person up until about 5 years ago. And so I went from this like stoic, even being a woman in business, feeling like I couldn't express emotion and I couldn't display emotion in the boardroom. And it was very much like, emotions are not for the office. And in order to be successful and respected, it was very much a environment of where you had to kind of remain calm, cool, and collected at all times and take your emotions and process them at home. One of the things that I've been excited about is we are very much, I'm seeing in an environment where emotions are more acceptable at work, and it is okay to talk about the things that are affecting you. And I think that as leaders, it's really helpful as a leader to know what's going on with your team and what they're going through emotionally so that you can help them ultimately integrate that and be more successful at work. I think, as you were talking about, back in the 90s and 2000s, I also was working at that time. Interestingly enough, also grew up in Texas. Maybe that's our barbecue connection right there. um, so in looking at that in the 90s of like, wow, like at that time, you really couldn't have these conversations to the level you can today. One, because belief systems and just rules and structure on what was acceptable, there were HR considerations to take into place that are just completely different today in terms of openness and willingness to address off work conversations in the work environment. What's like an example that you have where you've had to have that level of conversation with someone where maybe something was happening outside the office that may have been affecting their performance or something like that, where you've been able to kind of like navigate and help them be more successful both at home and at work?
Well, I think in general, I can cite back to a situation that happened, I want to say about 9 months ago. So it was gender related, unfortunately, and it was a very typical man versus woman. I feel like my opinion isn't being heard. I feel like I'm being belittled, etc. And hearing perspective and then having to kind of manage both sides of that. So I had to take in one side of the story, listen to all that information, and the key to that is don't try to fix what you're hearing. And so that's a very
Mm.
difficult thing, is any kind of conversation. And I think that this is me as a problem solver, but as well as in general, what I've noticed is when you start to take in someone venting and letting out their emotions and being vulnerable, it's not always, can I fix this problem right now? Sometimes it's literally just listening and not doing a thing, taking no action, just letting that happen for a little bit. But then also, once had that conversation, all right, awesome. What do you want me to do with this? Do you want me to take action? Because I can see that there's a situation where we can have a further conversation up the line with human resources, et cetera, et cetera. Do you want me to directly talk to the individual in their management chain? Do you want me to just listen and be here for you? How do you want to approach this? And so it's kind of like working with the situation and being open to that. And then, realizing like, sometimes you do have to just stop and listen and not do anything. That's super important. At the end of the day, that situation did eventually resolve itself, and so and not in a capacity where anyone was terminated or anything like that. It was more of a, I just need to vent about this. Let's see if we can approach it differently on how conversations happen, etc. And then the company in general did start to look at how our policies were on how conversations were being held. Um, you know, paying attention to how you're treating other people, et cetera. And so we did have some of those kind of training aspects of like making sure that you are paying attention to what's going on, your conversation, your ableist language and other things like that can impact people. And so it's
Mhm.
trying to be more aware of things that were commonplace before. Even if you don't intentionally mean anything behind them, the lack of thought can still be hurtful. And so,
Mhm.
trying to understand that even something that you think is meaningless can have a big impact. And so it's to pay attention to that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it comes on both sides, right? The person receiving the information has some kind of trigger themselves that's being hit on that maybe they don't necessarily know how to process. And then two, you as a leader have your own systems and triggers that can be fired in that process as well. I think what I love most about what you said is that sometimes your job as a leader is just to listen. Sometimes someone just needs the ability to vent. And I think that many of us as problem solvers, myself included, it can be challenging sometimes to just sit there and hold space for someone and not have a need to inject yourself in whatever is happening, be able to objectively look at what's happening, offer that person feedback if it's appropriate, and then decide if there's action that needs to be taken. Because let's be honest, interpersonal conflict sometimes is something that has to be handled between those two employees, and you can simply provide kind of swim lanes and frameworks for that, but ultimately we each are responsible for our own emotional responses.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that was, like I said, with that specific thing that had happened there, it was just listening to it and being like, "Hey, this isn't actually causing an immediate violation, so it's not like, oh, I have to stop this conversation, someone has to go get terminated." But it is something where it's like, okay, do you guys want to go hash this out? Do you want a mediator there? Is this venting? Where are we going with this, et cetera? And then just kind of going from there. But you're right,
Mhm.
my immediate response, just from how I was raised, was literally to take care of. Like I'm, a shelterer kind of scenario, and it's not meant to belittle like a woman's position, but it's like I automatically feel like I have to do that just by how I
Mhm.
was raised, and so I was like, no, 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 I can't do this. Let me just take this in. How can I empower you and not just take that away from you and try to go fix the problem? Let me let
Mhm.
you decide and kind of go from there, and then let me support you in however that decision comes by.
So now let's shift gears a little bit from talking about leadership into talking about marketing context a little bit. As we look at marketing, I think there's two pieces of this conversation that are relevant. One, as a marketer, what I've found in my own research and just my own process is that there's this thing called creative flow state. And Wayne and I have been hackers of flow state for quite some time. So I know we can have this conversation about how do you get to the zone? And when you get to the zone, what the impact of that is. So one of the things I found in my own process of being a flow state hacker and a biohacker was I was able to successfully hack into flow state, meaning that I could come into work and I could hit that zone, repeat it. I could do it, repeatably. I could do it predictably. But what was happening on the other side of that is that the neurological chemicals that my brain produces, the feel good chemicals, if you will, are released during that process of flow state. And so on the back end of that, I would go into work and I was hacking flow state and I come in and be like, man, I'm on fire. But then the next day I'd be in a slump. And I wasn't connecting the two of that my creative flow state was actually contributing to that slump on the other end. And as I started to do more research into like Stephen Cutler's research and some others, I found out that creative flow state actually can cause depression. And that because you're releasing all of these neurochemicals, on the other side of it, if you're not aware of that, then you can have some big depression. And I think that in our industry in particular, I've seen a huge rise in the amount of marketers who are being open about how they're feeling with anxiety and depression and what's happening. So I was curious of your perspective in terms of from a marketing creative process and being able to kind of integrate these emotions. Do you have any tips for managing emotions in the workplace?
I'm still not the best at that. I'll just openly admit, still struggling with trying to figure out, um, just with my own interpersonal struggle when I am comfortable or trying to be comfortable with having those kind of conversations with people, and
Mhm.
saying like, "Hey, this is emotionally weighing on me," or "I need to take a break from this and walk away for a little bit." So I could be a little bit better about that myself. But I think it's really kind of touching back to what I was just saying in the sense of taking that action, and despite your potential fear or any kind of bias that had been given to you unhealthily as you're growing up, just knowing talking about it is important. And this is actually almost a little micro segue with this. We did work with a client called the U Rock Foundation. The gentleman that founded that, his name is Joseph Pinola. He did it as a way to express grief. So he had lost his
Mm.
father at age 16, and this is in the 90s, so like 95, 96, etc. And he had no idea, one, that there were grief counselors, and then two, how to communicate the emotions that he was feeling because he didn't have the vocabulary. There weren't words there for what he was feeling. He ended up making a emotional connection with Nine Inch Nails' Downward Spiral album, and he's like, "This music, these lyrics, these songs, etc. This is what I feel right now." And he survived two suicide attempts, and
Wow.
so he created this organization where he works with people like Jonathan Davies of Korn and other large people that are in rock to get their messages out around how they are also being vulnerable and how they've struggled with suicide and grief and other things along these lines. And so it was something that we really connected with because it was the same kind of thing we see where people don't know how to actually have the verbal vocabulary to express this. And sometimes there's still a lot of fear about saying, "Hey, I feel sad. Hey, I feel suicidal. Like I want to hurt myself."
Hmm.
And then giving them a platform where they can either start to express emotions or even find the emotions to express and then have an avenue to something like grief counseling or something along those lines. um,
Hmm.
and so it's the same kind of thing. It's being able to understand that people are willing to listen and people are there to help. And then it's getting past your own fear and taking the action to just have the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, as you mentioned, it's so true that so many times we have emotions and we don't know what the emotion actually is. I know for myself, when I really started to tap into identifying emotions, which is the first stage of emotional intelligence, is awareness, right? Being able to like identify what your own emotions are and to identify them accurately. And there's a big spectrum, like you have depression, despair, grief, all at one end of the spectrum, and you probably have joy, bliss, elation kind of at the other end of the spectrum. But the shades in between are very gray, if you will, in terms of what's the difference between despair and sadness, and how do you know? Many times it comes into a conversation of intensity and how intense that emotion actually is. And so, what I've noticed many times is that when we speak about emotions, you hear words like fear a lot. And many times when you start to dig into fear, you actually discover that that fear is the surface level emotion that the person can identify, but there can be as many as 5 or 6 emotions beneath that that are actually that are culminating into fear and being called fear, but those 5 or 6 underlying emotions aren't being necessarily identified. And so if you're trying to process your emotions and you're processing them at the umbrella, if you will, versus looking at what's beneath that umbrella, it can be very confusing for people in terms of one, identification, and two, integration. If you don't really understand what you're feeling, it's very difficult sometimes to be able to integrate and process that.
Yeah, for sure. And then even the flip side of that, I mean, with what's going on with us politically and culturally right now in the United States, there's a lot of racial hate and tension that's still coming back up today. And what's driving that? And a lot of times when you see it's like, well, hate more than likely is usually backed by something like fear, which is also backed by just lack of information, lack of knowledge, dehumanization, just not being aware of someone's situation.
Hmm.
And you see that a lot where it's like if someone feels a certain way to somebody just because of the volume of a chemical in their skin, why do you feel this way? It's like, well, those people are different. Why are they different? Well, I'm
Hmm.
not sure. It's like, okay, well, they like to eat the same food you do. Some of them go to the same bars you do and drink the same alcohol. They like the same books. They listen to the same music. Oh,
Hmm.
okay. Well, we're kind of the same person, right? So why'd you hate them? Oh, I have no idea, right? And
Yeah.
so it's this mix of lack of understanding and then emotional layers, fear
Yeah.
driving hate, which is driving something else, right?
Yeah, it's very interesting. And you're right, like just the emotional climate right now, especially, we talked about on the last interview too, kind of coming into election year. I like there's a lot of emotions that are coming up even now. And I expect that to continue through 2020. And so that integration of what people are feeling on the outside of work, and then they bring that into work. So if there's this like emotional spectrum like this right now of like people all kind of all over the place, and then that's coming into the work, it can create conflicts sometimes that we don't expect. So I think that as leaders, it's really important for us to really get clear about our own emotional intelligence and to start opening these dialogues with our team members, because the next 18 months are very likely to have some big emotional outlays for everyone, regardless of what your stance is. I always say I don't talk politics, I talk emotions. And regardless of what your stance is, it's very clear that there are some polarizing emotions happening on all sides of the fence. Um, And one of the, keys of emotional intelligence is empathy. And empathy is the ability to kind of sit in someone else's shoes and to understand the emotional perspective of that other person. And so as marketers, empathy is one of our superpowers. It's something we do often for our target customers and sometimes forget to do for ourselves and forget to do for our team. So I wanted to kind of shift a little bit and start talking about the customer journey in marketing and how can we use empathy and emotional intelligence in that journey in order to connect at a more deeper level with our customers.
For sure. This is actually a subject that's really close to us because we do so much with accessibility. So, a lot of the things that you'll either hear in the news now or not even hear in the news, depending upon what's being discussed, is a lot of accessibility lawsuits are starting to show up. And
Mm.
so what's happening is, famous people like Beyonce or Domino's Pizza, the huge Domino lawsuit that's going on right now, will have their websites that are built and look fancy and are super pretty and all of the artsy fancy stuff, but then they're not considering whether or not a reader might have a cognitive problem like high speed motion might make them sick or dizzy, or not being able to see colors appropriately. Color blindness is the most common thing, but there's a bunch of different ways that you don't necessarily perceive color and saturation appropriately, or not appropriately, but like other people or a majority of people do.
Mhm.
And so appropriately, that's that's one of those things that's unfortunately that's leaking old biased
That's your
coming out.
unconscious bias coming through,
Yeah,
right?
it just comes through. So yeah, so I apologize for that. And again, being aware of what your unconscious words might actually cause. But even going from that, so color, how you perceive color and how you take in light and other pieces, and then also people that can't see at all. A whole
Mhm.
section of people that are blind that use screen readers, and whether or not your site works with a screen reader, and then screen reader technology. Three different kinds that are available for Windows, two or that are available for Mac. The phone is different than the desktop, which is different than the laptop, that's different than the tablet. It's a big
Mhm.
mess. So having empathy and just understanding the fact that no, not everybody is you sitting in front of the website building it. There are people that might just need to use the keyboard because either they are having problems with something like arthritis, or they might not even have a hand. Right. What
Yeah.
about somebody, that, similar to like a Stephen Hawking, where, not able to use anything from your neck down and you have to use like one of these blow sip kind of
Mhm.
interfaces or something like that. How would somebody like that navigate your website? And so it's thinking about who else would have access to this, who would need access to this information, and how you can kind of build for that, be it an actual web property or a marketing sales funnel or the information that you're trying to move through. It's trying to sit in those people's shoes and figure that out.
So we also have some experience in the web accessibility space as well. And one of the interesting things that I found with the client that we're working with is that many times the story of accessibility is very much a story about compliance and risk. That's kind of the natural way to market accessibility. And it actually was one of the first things I looked at from an emotional intelligence perspective is how can we be more empathetic to the person on the other end of the machine and telling this story in a totally different way of, if you look at accessibility from the perspective of a marketer, it's not necessarily a conversation of volume. And many times when we make financial decisions, we make decisions based on volume. How many people does this affect? And so when you think about something like accessibility, it might only affect a small percentage of your website visitors, and quite frankly, you probably don't even know how many. Um, However, if you start to look at it on the individual level, it's like, do you really want someone who's blind and wants to have your content not to be able to see it? The question generally is no. However, the understanding of how you fix that is a little bit more complicated, which I'm sure you know very well. However, I think that most marketers in general they want to be empathetic to their customers, and this is a blind spot for them, quite literally, right? That they don't understand that these audiences exist. There are legal requirements for you to have accessibility on your website, but the actual thought process of including it in a website build and things like that, that's fairly new and it's coming into market right now, which I think is very interesting.
So actually, just a quick point to that, there are not legal requirements for a web
Oh.
property, and that's actually what the fight with Domino's is happening right now. So what, from a web standpoint, the ADA in general, so the Disability Act, Accessibility and Disability Act, sorry, does cite work related senses of like curb cuts, sidewalks, access to buildings, physical, how doors work, other things like that. It doesn't specifically outline digital properties like web pages. So
Mm,
when someone's building a website, we follow something called, we term it the WCAG, but what it is, the Web Accessibility and Content Guideline. So it's
mm,
a suggestion on this is how you should approach these type of situations, but it's
mhm,
not a hard and fast law that you have to follow it, which is actually kind of the situation that's going on with Domino's. So if people aren't familiar with the Domino's situation, so Domino's Pizza has a online pizza builder. Basically, you can go to their website, choose your cheeses, your toppings, all the other fun stuff, etc. It is 100% inaccessible from a screen reader and keyboard standpoint. So
wow.
they got sued. And what
Mhm,
they did is they reviewed it back, and they're actually fighting it, trying to take it all the way back to the Supreme Court on the standing that the law doesn't state that the website has to be accessible, because somebody that is blind or can't use the keyboard can just call the phone and get the pizza. So there's still a way for them to get the food. They don't have to go through the remediation of the web page. And so
mhm,
they, from a certain perspective, you can look at that and be like, well, hey, why are you being jerks to people that aren't accessible? And really what the conversation's happening around the legal team is they're actually trying to get stronger legal enforcement, saying that no, if you want us to follow this, make a law that says we have to follow it, and please do it right. Think
mhm,
about it appropriately. Don't just throw it out there, because what's been happening is with all of these lawsuits, some of them are legitimate. The person that did sue Domino's wasn't able to get their pizza through the web page. The person that did sue Beyonce was unable to get tickets for her show because the website didn't link them to Ticketmaster appropriately.
mhm,
So those are legitimate cases, but now what's happening is you're getting the quote ambulance chasers, where lawyers are just suing you, period, with or without a client, just saying, "Oh, your website's not accessible, $5,000, please." And so they're
mhm,
starting a whole litany of useless legal cases. And so Domino's is trying to kind of fall on the sword of, let's get an actual law in place so that we can
mhm.
eliminate the litany of poor legal, implementations, basically.
Yeah, it comes into the conversation of like where a company stands on their, I guess, their thought process around compliance, and also their thought process around serving their customer base. So obviously, Domino's has these customers and feels that they're serving them, and then also clearly recognizes they could do a better job, and they're just questioning whether or not the law states that they have to. It's very interesting when you start to get into the complexity of regulation, as well as just what's the right thing to do in terms of serving your customer in the best way possible. If you know you have these customers that want to be able to view your website and you have the ability to ensure that they can, obviously we all want to do the right thing and we want to make sure that everybody who wants to see the website can. Um, I'm curious too, just from a marketing perspective, looking at the entire customer journey. So the accessibility is one piece. What are some other ways that you have used emotional intelligence in the marketing process?
Well, so it's still across the board. I think you apply it the same way, regardless of who the person you're trying to be empathetic is. So whether or not you're thinking about someone with a screen reader, where it's like, you look at how money is written, dollar sign, 500. A screen reader will say that dollar sign 500. It will not say $500. And so
Mm,
it's, do I need to think about how that is said? But then it's also, in general, what is this message? Is this message just, hey, buy, 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 like an infomercial? Or, are you actually trying to reach somebody at an emotional level and basically say, like, hey, this service that we're offering you is, mortgage related, but it's not just, hey, get a mortgage from us because we want your interest. It's no, we have some financial backing and we can help people that have hurt credit, or we can try to help you repair from a bankruptcy or something along those lines. And you're trying to find someone that kind of fits into those fields, and then actually structuring not just your marketing materials but your service to actually implement what you're saying. So it's not just, hey, we offer bankruptcy repair. It's no, we literally do. We have people that have been bankrupt that have gone through the 7 years and have repaired their credit, and this is how we did it, and how can we
mhm,
help you actually accomplish this task. So it's not just the message, but it's, I think
mhm.
the marketing term is eat your own dog food. um, so not only say the thing you want to do, but do the thing that you are saying you will do.
Yeah, that integrity in the marketing process is really key in terms of one, just being authentic to who you are, but two, not making promises that you're not delivering on throughout the entire process. So, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you being on the show today and having lots of conversation around emotional intelligence, both from a leadership perspective as well as from a marketing perspective. We also appreciate you responding to the survey and reaching out for an interview, and wish you all the best of luck.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Nicole. This has been a blast.